Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here to today's TPA Masterclass on why and how engaging families and young audiences is great for growth. And in today's recorded event, we're going to be hearing from podcasting professionals on this topic. Before we get started, I just wanted to invite you all into our 1,000-strong virtual community of podcasters across the world. If you aren't yet a TPA member, we welcome you and are glad to have you here. We offer these about quarterly, and this is just one sampling of our programming. Please do reach out. I'm going to put my email in there, education@thepodcastacademy.com. If you have questions about joining, otherwise hop on over to thepodcastacademy.com to sign up. We also host the EMBs and have all sorts of other kind of cool networking opportunities for you. So moving forward, if you do have any type of other engagement channels such as these, this is where you can find us. We have a diversity of handles and we're all over the place. So we hope to see you both in this space and also on our socials. And we do want to thank our education and community building sponsor, Wondery, for underwriting this program. So let me just go ahead and get out of the way so that we can hear from these wonderful panelists. I'm going to pass the mic over to our wonderful facilitator, TPA member, and founder of the hit Family and Kids podcast, Dorktales Storytime, Jodi Murphy. Thank you, Jodi, for being here. Take it away.
Hey, thank you, Amanda. We're so excited to be here. Amanda and I have been working on this, putting this together for quite a while. And as she said, I'm the founder and the executive producer of an indie podcast called Dorktales Storytime. We tell original tales with a geekish twist, with positive messages and positive role models. And I have a small independent team of creators. And when we got into this space, I sought out where we could find a community of like-minded creators who really cared about their audiences as much as we do. And I'm really excited that today we are have panelists from two of my most trusted sources, an organization called Kids Listen, of which I'm a member, and Common Sense Media. And before we begin, I'd love for all of the panelists to introduce themselves and talk about what they do and what they create. So Chad, would you start?
I would love to. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Chad. I am a kids podcast writer and producer. Most recently, I was with America's Test Kitchen, where I wrote and produced 6 seasons of their mystery recipe podcast. I've also worked for Gimlet Media. I still work on their toothbrushing show Chompers, and have done shows for Spotify, Neon Hum, lots of other. Oh, and I a co-founder and producer of Girl Tales, which is an independent podcast where we tell feminist retellings of popular fairy tales. So check us out there.
Laura, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Jodi. I'm Laura Ordoñez. I am from Common Sense Media, formerly head of podcast and YouTube, and now head of digital content. So I oversee all of our digital content now. But when I came onto the scene of Common Sense Media about 2 years ago, I was brought on to launch our podcast ratings and reviews channel, which is our newest reviews channel in over a decade, which is really exciting. So now it's up and running. We rate and review podcasts for parents and educators to really give them an understanding of, what's in a podcast, maybe educational value, diverse representation, things like that. And Common Sense is really, for anyone who's not aware of Common Sense or our mission, we are the leading nonprofit really there to help guide and educate and give a better and healthier understanding to the media realm for parents and their families.
Awesome. And Melly.
Hey everybody, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're in the world. My name is Melissa Victor, also known as Melly. I am the creator and host of a kids podcast called Stoopkid Stories. You might have heard of it, you might not, but it's okay. It's a story podcast about Black kids just living their best lives in the city And we follow these 7 amazing characters throughout their daily lives and how they take on challenges and problem solve and build community with each other, build community with the grownups in their lives. And it's like Hey Arnold and like Doug and Rugrats, just like on a podcast with all Black kids. I'm also the board president of the amazing organization called Kids Listen. And I am also a producer writer for an SEL podcast called The Imagined Neighborhood.
That's great. So I think, Melly, let's stick with you, and to kick off our conversation, Kids Listen just published a research report called Kids Podcasts in the Age of Screens. And can you walk us through some of the highlights of some of the really interesting and exciting news that we found out as a result of the survey?
Oh yeah, for sure. So for those who don't know, have never heard of Kids Listen, Kids Listen is a grassroots organization full of amazing kid podcast creators who advocate for high quality audio content in the podcast space. And I just want to shout out some of the OG Kids Listen members who have been a part of Kids Listen since its inception. And this is actually our 3rd survey that the organization has done. And before we hit this slide, I wanted to go back to some earlier numbers from one of the first surveys, because I think that's really, really important when we talk about kid podcasting and how kids are listening and how kids are listening with their grownups, how kids are listening with their peers, right? And one of the big takeaways was this idea of co-listening, which is like super unique in kid podcasting because, you know, parents, educators, people who have little kids, they throw an iPad at a kid and then they just walk away so they can go cook dinner, so they can go fold the laundry. But we found in kid podcasting that 98% of kids listen in a group with an adult and a child, which I think is fascinating because I don't remember growing up that I sat down and watched Rugrats with my mom, or I sat down and watched Arthur with my mom. But we find that in the podcasting space, adults are actively listening with their children. Another fun fact from an earlier survey is that 95% of children listen to podcasts in their car. So going to school, going to after school activities, just in transit, which can also lead to positive conversations and great bonding experience between an adult and a child. So that was really, really fascinating. But if we look at this first slide from the most recent survey, it says that 91% of kids listen to a podcast at least once a week. And I think that's really, really exciting, especially for podcasts who post on a weekly cadence. So kids are coming back once a week to listen to their favorite shows. Like I know Girl Tales posts once a week, so I want to follow what's happening here. I know Dorktales is posting once a week, so I want to follow next week. So we can see that cadence and see the rhythm of how podcasting is landing in these kids' lives, right? And then we also see that 48%, almost half of kids listeners listen on a daily basis, which is also so crazy because that means that we as creators are a part of these kids' daily lives. We are part of bath time. We are part of bedtime. We are part of car time. We are part of your morning breakfast time. And that's really, really powerful. And you'll probably hear me talk about this thing called trust, building trust with your audience a lot throughout this next hour or however much time we have. Because building trust with your audience, I think is so, so important. It should be at the top of everything that we do in this space. And so to see that nearly half of kids listeners are bringing us into their homes, into their cars, into their daily routines, into their routines on a daily basis is really, really powerful and something that we should, really strive to keep doing. Yeah, can we go to the next slide? Cool. And I get this question a lot when people are starting their podcast, whether it's a kid podcast or just a podcast in general, about advertising, right? And we'll talk more about like COPPA laws and things like that later in the presentation. But we learned from this survey that parents really, really trust kid podcasting. They really, really trust the creators, and they really, really trust the voices that are behind these characters, these hosts, these storytellers. We have a really high number that 75% of parents gave their favorite kid podcast the highest rating of trustworthiness when it came to advertisements over, their family, their favorite blog, magazines, their favorite influencers and TV shows. So advertising is still, we don't want to advertise strictly to kids and things like that, but this is something to look at when we're talking about monetization in the space. How do we monetize this show? So I found that 78% number really, really high. 75%, excuse me, number really, really high, that parents really, really do trust the shows that they're bringing in to their kids' lives. I found that really, really fascinating. And we can move to the next slide. And this is really interesting. And I've had this conversation with people who are outside of kid podcasting, who are just in podcasts in general. And I talk to a lot of adults, and I'm one of the adults who watch podcasts on YouTube. And as you can see here, 58% of adults listen on YouTube. And the podcasts, like talk show aspect of it, the line is kind of blurred. If we're all sitting up here and we have mics in front of our hands, but we put the video on YouTube, is that technically a podcast? Because I was wondering, is podcast strictly audio? So we still have to dive more into why only 8% of kids are listening on YouTube. But that's also a thumbs up if we really want to get kids away from their screens and just doing some screen-free playing. Don't go listen to us on YouTube. Go to the new kids apps that are coming on the market. Go to Apple, go to Spotify, make your own playlist, put your phone down, and draw pictures of your favorite characters, write a story based on the story that you heard, so they're not staring at the screen all day. But that line is still kind of blurred between, are the shows on YouTube that have a visual or animated component, are they considered podcasts? As opposed to just strictly listening in the audio world. So that's something that we'll have to dig more into. But we just wanted to bring up the YouTube findings because YouTube does have that podcast component now. So we'll probably see some new numbers in the coming months of how that develops.
And I also think one of the other interesting things that came up was kids are loyal listeners. So they'll listen to an episode. I think it was 61% listen 2 to 9 times to a particular episode. So they come back, they love the hosts, and for those of us that are doing storytelling, the characters, and I think that's something that is unique to kids podcasts, that they listen multiple times over and over again. I'm curious, Laura, from you and people at Common Sense Media, have you any other data or anecdotal information about how parents and educators value or look at kids' podcasts?
Yeah. So when we first, were getting ready to build the podcast channel, we did a lot of internal surveys from our current users, from those that weren't users, but, outsourced, other parents, and talked to them about podcasts. And it really did align with a lot of what Kids Listen is finding, which we found really interesting, especially when it came to like what kids were looking for. Like, kids love shows that are funny. They love the comedy shows. They love the entertainment value, right? And I think I get this a lot of the times about like, oh, we have like an edutainment type, background, and edutainment kind of has become this like what we kind of think of as like a taboo word, not because it's bad, but I think because if you're going to be making quality kids content of any kind, there is an educational value in that, right? Like, if it's a good kids content, there is going to be some sort of educational value, whether that learning vocabulary or learning social emotional lessons, right? So I think a lot of times, which we all know here, I'm sure, if we present it as, hey, this is fun and educational, it can sometimes be like, we're good, thank you, bye. But I think more so, you should always just think of what value is this bringing to the kid's life. And so I think that's what we were really seeing when we were starting to build our podcast channel, is that parents did want the educational value, but they also wanted just like some entertainment for kids that was screen free. So we saw that. And on the educational side with our educators, we have a huge part of our nonprofit is our education team who are on the ground. They are teaching our digital citizenship curriculum in schools throughout the country. And last year, we really started to do some webinars about podcasts in the classroom. And when I tell you, educators are so excited about using podcasts in the classroom. They want more and more and more. They've come back to us asking for more details about like breaking down how to use kids podcasts in the classroom, like very simple things about like, how do I access these podcasts? Like what can I do with them? So we also find that when kids podcasts do have an element of whether it's a worksheet or a coloring page, or, you know, we have our discussion questions that we have on each review, something to help the educators that's already there that they can use in class as a follow-up to listening is really amazing too. And, you know, we're really excited to kind of go more in depth this year in the classrooms and talk about, you know, what possibilities there are for podcasts in that education space. And what I will say too is, if your kids are listening to podcasts in the classroom, the whole goal of the educator is to be able to like take that home and listen at home, which then, you know, kind of blends with their parents' world because the parent is most likely listening to their own podcast, right? So like Melly was saying, you know, that's a bonding experience right there. So that's really what we're finding so far.
Really interesting. Chad, you're able to speak from both a corporate perspective and an indie podcast perspective. So I'm really interested in when you started working with America's Test Kitchen, when you created or helped to create Mystery Recipe, what was important for them and how did it help their brand grow, or you know, what were the benefits to them for starting that podcast? And then comparing that to the growth of Girl Tales and the podcast that you work on as a writer or producer.
Yeah, I mean, they are very different. So to start with Mystery Recipe was a kids cooking podcast from ATK, which is America's Test Kitchen. When they reached out to me, they had just started a whole kids brand. And so it was called ATK Kids. They were treating it almost like a startup where they were just trying to convert a lot of the recipes and cooking content for young chefs. And so I came in to help develop this podcast for them. And it did a couple things. We did sell ads, and so there was revenue coming from ad sales. But primarily, ATK already had an adult podcast. It's called Proof. It's still out. It's excellent. But they had a lot of the infrastructure, technology, workflow in place in order to produce podcasts. They wanted to grow that audience, but they didn't want to eat into their own Proof audience by producing more and more adult food themed content. And so Mystery Recipe was a great solution because they had a lot of the stuff in place in order to make it, but we're not eating into existing listeners of their adult show. Even more so than that, we really focused hard on we took advantage of marketing opportunities within America's Test Kitchen, like newsletters, website placement, and things like that. But we put a majority of our efforts into cross promotion with other kids' podcasts. That way, we're not just folding ATK fans into the kids podcast, but we're bringing entire new families to the brand. And so we cross promoted with other kid shows, made sure that people who are coming in could then get more information about ATK as a brand. We occasionally advertised our kids' cookbooks on the pod. We advertised subscription box services, all of which brought value to the brand in indirect ways. And so not only were we focused on ad sales, but we really were focused on getting the word out about ATK Kids as, experts in the food media landscape. So I think those cross promotions with other shows, as opposed to just focusing on ATK fans already, brought a lot of value to the company itself. Girl Tales was very different. We didn't have sort of like a trusted brand name going into creating that podcast. We didn't have ad sale goals. Basically, we're just motivated by the moral of the podcast. We wanted to remind girls that they can do anything. We wanted to have fairy tales that featured every type of girl or non-binary character at the center of the story. So it wasn't as profit driven. Really, we have been working to pay our artists, pay our writers, and Rebecca Cunningham, who might be here, is very good about pushing for all of that. But that's really like where the financial goals are for that show. And so the growth is just different. One really helpful tool that we had on Mystery Recipe, when we would cross promote with a kids podcast that had a big audience, But Why, Brains On, for example, are great kids shows that have large audiences. When Mystery Recipe was first starting, we didn't have a lot of download numbers. We were brand new. And so we were able to go to them and say, hi, if we can swap a promo with 120,000 impressions on it, we'll get whatever we can get on Mystery Recipe, and then we'll put it on Proof, the adult show that's already established, so that you can definitely get all of those impressions. And so that was a huge help in getting our promos on big shows with a lot of impressions before we were able to hit those numbers. Girl Tales didn't have an adult alternative. They didn't have, we didn't have a partner show to kind of finish that swap with. And so it's just different. I think the Girl Tales base is stronger. I think the Girl Tales base is broader and more committed to the show because they've been building with the show for a lot longer than Mystery Recipe has. Yeah, I would say that's my answer.
That's interesting. Very. Melly, you are a spectacular one-woman show when it comes to your podcast, Stoopkid Stories. What have been some of the keys to your growth and success, and what are you really focusing on today for your podcast?
I think, and I feel like people won't like this answer because people want the formula to success, right? But my podcast came in at a time where I feel the need. And it came in at the height of the pandemic when kids were home and parents were looking for something for their children to do. And also, unfortunately, but fortunately for me, there weren't really any shows in the space that were featuring Black stories and Black kids. So we were in the midst of a pandemic and then the Black uprising of police brutality against Black bodies. And so everyone was scrambling to either get stories that reflected their world or stories that brought a diverse repertoire to their collection. And my podcast landed right in that pocket. So that's like the main thing. Like I feel the need for kids who look like me to hear stories that sound like them from a place where they live and they grow up that they can recognize. And also for kids who don't look like me or grew up like me can learn something about kids who live in urban communities, kids with coily hair, kids with darker skin. Also to piggyback, such a corporate thing, I hate the word piggyback, but to piggyback the cross promotion, I cross promoted like crazy, shout out to Girl Tales, What a World, Peace Out Stories, the Imagine Neighborhood Stories podcast. Like I was able to co-write with them or do a feed swap or guest on their show and do like an Instagram live on my Instagram with them. So it was a lot of cross promotion. And I'm forever indebted to those creators who brought me on, within the first 6 months of Stoopkids to really give me that boost and that push. So if you're out there and you're starting out and you have a small audience, like connect with the community, connect with the Kids Listen community, even podcasts where other kids listen, connect, get to know, find what shows. If you're a social emotional learning show, connect with another social emotional learning show and, create content and stories and experiences so that y'all both can grow and thrive in the space. And right now, I kind of touched on this in the question and answer. A lot of the questions like, how do you monetize? And like, I haven't really done ads on my show, and I'm really focused now on like, what does podcast programming look like? For those who don't know, I did Stoopkid Stories turned into a live musical 2 years ago. I was able to produce it at Summit Theater New Canaan. We did a live 75-minute musical with beautiful actors and things like that. It was a great show. It ran for a season. So we're trying to get that into different schools and tour it around the country. But also, how do I get my show into museums? How can I do programming for museums and libraries and schools? I know a couple Kids Listen members just went up to Boston just recently and did a whole live podcast day. And I think that is fantastic. And that is amazing. And that is another way that you can take your audio show, find a way to monetize it and have it grow outside of your Spotify, Apple Podcast link. So for your particular show, what does podcast programming look like? Do you make a musical? Do you make a library story time every Saturday with your local library? Do you go into a museum and you celebrate Pride Day and do a story time with a whole bunch of stories that feature members of the LGBTQ community? Do you go to shelters and things like that and promote your stories about neurodiversity? Like, how do you bring your show outside of your RSS feed and bring it alive into the communities that you're serving? So that's one of my big focuses now of Stoopkids, is to bring my RSS feed to life even more than what it is.
Yeah, that's great. And I know from both of you, hands down, the best way for our podcast growth has been the cross promotion in not only running promotions, swapping a promo, doing feed drops, and even pulling people into our content and our storytelling. Melly plays an amazing STEM princess in our Rapunzel, Let Down Your Science Experiment story. And so that really has been, that connecting with community has been really important for us too. Laura, what have you learned or observed about network or branded kids podcasts and those that are independently produced? How are each doing in terms of inspiring their young listeners and gaining parent trust?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always think about when I first came to Common Sense, and I think one of the first people I talked to in a group was Kids Listen, and Melly was there. And that was definitely their concern was, we had a partnership with Apple. We still continue to grow our partnership with Apple, which we love so much. We curate their entire kids and family space. And, they were saying, like, we want to make sure, like, there's good representation of all the kids shows that are out there. And I made it, my mission from day one after that conversation to make sure that we were elevating not only well-known networks and big names, right? Because that does build trust with parents who already know, like a Nickelodeon, right? Like who are already listening to shows from Wondery, right? Of course, we know that. But looking and understanding how many independent creators are actually creating such amazing content. I think, there's this perception that, like, oh, if it's an independent creator, like, oh, they're just doing it for fun. The beauty of the podcast world is, like, anyone can pick up a mic and create good content. They really can. And, if you know audio, you can even do that through your phone, right? But it's like, what's the intention? And that's really what we look at with our reviews. Like, what is the intention behind this content? Like, where is it? Who is it reaching? Like, what is it trying to get to? And a lot of the times you're finding that these independent creators are way more intentional sometimes, right? Because they care so much about it, right? So we definitely aim to amplify both. And it's not like, oh, this month we're going to do this many shows from like these networks or this many independent. It's looking at the content and seeing what's quality, like first and foremost, right? And so if you look at, whether it's our reviews and our seal selections, which is kind of what we give like the best of the best and amplify out there, or our marketing tactics, which really end up being currently very focused in our Apple curations, you're going to see a culmination of both. And I always make sure that there's independent creators there, because I think there's independent creators out there just creating such great work. And I think that it can be, talking to a lot of these creators, and especially like, Melly, I know, who like does it all on her own. I'm just like, this is insane. How do you do this? But I know it can be, we've seen so many great shows out there that have started that I'm like, oh, I wish the show would have just continued. It's so amazing. But I get that, like, it's a hard hustle. Yeah. It's a hard hustle. So I always say, keep going, and then look where you can start to build, and look where you can start to grow, and look where you can find support. And, we do try to offer that support through like marketing and thought leadership partnerships with different creators. So that's where we try to amplify and help independent creators.
Yeah, it's so good to hear, because the independent creator is starting from ground zero. They don't, unless you have built an audience in another area, you're coming to it at, zero potential audience, or maybe just a small audience. And so it's a very slow process that you have to every day kind of just continue to build, connect. And as Melly, as you were talking about, going to a classroom or a library, I mean, it's that small that you can do, and you maybe gain, 3-4 listeners here, but you're building a community and looking at it for the long term. And so the fact that you do care for indie podcasters is very inspiring to hear. Let's talk about representation and inclusion. The majority of my very small creative team are neurodivergent, and we have been advocating, speaking out just for a seat at the table, to be heard, to have characters that represent, authentic characters that represent who we are. And so it's very important to me about having that diversity and inclusion as part of your mission, and making sure that our stories and the things that we produce are inclusive, so kids get the message that they're worthy and valuable just the way that they are. I'd like to start with you, Laura, on this. One of Common Sense Media's core principles is diverse representations in terms of content and creators. Can you speak more about this?
Yes, I love this topic. So when I came on the scene, we had actually just done a study. So we have a really amazing kind of research section, and we had just done a study that was, pretty much said what we all know. Like, parents want their kids' media to represent not only their children and what they look like, what they sound like, their background, who they are as a person, but they also want their media to represent what the world looks like, which is very diverse and very different, right? And that was the impetus of creating our diverse representation section of our ratings and reviews, where we dive deep, and I say dive deep, into what diverse representation means. And this is why I always say, like, if you're submitting for review for your podcast, like, I give a template, and we want to know more than just like, okay, give us like 3 episodes and like a summary of the show. Like, where did this come from? Like, I know Chad and I have had some really great discussions about, like, where are these characters coming from, and learning that from him. I'm like, we can put that in our review, because understanding the intention and who these characters are, and like where that comes from in the creators, is so important. And that builds that trust with the parents of like reading like, oh, the people who are creating this are neurodivergent and they're creating the show because that must mean something to them, right? So when we look at our diverse representation, sometimes we will have, you know, creators come and say like, well, we felt like we should have gotten like a higher rating on diverse representation. And sometimes that looks like because it just checked a box of like, hey, we had like a Latino character and a Black character. And that's not what we're doing there. What we're doing is like, okay, you have a Black and a Latino character. Like, how are they featured, right? Are they prominently featured? Are they feeding any stereotypes, right? Do you have like a neurodiverse character? Like, is that reflective of the neurodiverse world, or are they just put in there because you want to check a box? And I just think being super intentional is so important. And that comes with like getting a consultant, like a, you know, a DEI consultant, like making sure that you are really reflecting that child's world. Because if there's one thing about kids, like they can sniff out, you know, what's going on. They know their world and they don't have a filter about it. So if it's not right, they're not buying it, you know?
Yeah, Melly, you talked a little bit about Stoopkid Stories and how you filled a need. What has it meant for your young listeners to hear the stories that you tell?
Oh my goodness, it really does the heart good when I get a video or a letter from a kid who says, you know, thank you for the episode about being a Black girl who swims. Thank you for the episode about saying my hair is beautiful. Thank you for the episode about standing up to kids who look different to me, who are picking on me, right? And diversity, having a show that's for diversity is for the family that has a monolithic catalog already, right? So if everything in your catalog is white, I am the diversity quota in that. But I don't really want to be that. I want to be for the catalog to add to the Black stories that you already have, right? To the marginalized stories that you already have. And for kids who grew up in urban communities, for kids who are adopted like me, for kids who grew up doing white sports, grew up being the Black kid on their gymnastics team, like, what does that look like? How do you face that adversity at 7, 8, 9 years old? How do you find your voice? How do you find your voice among your friends? How do you find your voice with your teachers? How do you find your voice with your parents? It means, and I hope that for the kids who are listening, that they can take away something from each episode, whether you look like me or not, you know. Like at the end of each episode, I ask a question for them to talk about with their grown-ups. And I think that's a really important part of my show, particularly, that they can go back and talk about the issues in the show. So I hope that it means something amazing to them. You know, the letters and the videos I get, you know, tell me that they are forever grateful, but, you know.
Yeah, it's beautiful. That's great. Chad, talk about your intern character and how you work with the writing consultants to form the character and those that you hire to actually perform the character.
100%, yeah. So for anyone who's not watching this panel, I am a cisgendered white man, and diversity and inclusion is the backbone of the work that I try and do. But I think as someone who has the experiences that I have, I want to do so carefully, not play into tropes, not put anything forward that I think is what this community is looking for, because I don't know what this community is looking for. And so to oversimplify and say this very quickly, there's a pretty easy to follow routine that I do when I'm developing a character that is outside of my own experiences. The first thing I do is find a writing consultant or a sensitivity reader who is a part of that community. And I'm not approaching that writing consultant saying, here is a fully developed character that I would like to include in the podcast. I'm approaching that consultant saying, I would like to include someone who is non-binary. I would like to include someone who is on the autism spectrum, visually disabled, any number of different identities that we featured on the show. Is this a good idea? Is this something you think your community is looking for? B, what is overdone in this field? Like, what type of characters do you see too much of? What tropes are not going to be helpful? And then C, what is the perfect version of this character, either for you specifically or that you think that the community that you're a part of is asking for? And so we got some really lovely responses to issues that I would never even wouldn't be on my radar at all, that became sort of foundational to these characters because we started with a consultant and didn't just send them something to get their stamp of approval on it. That was my idea. So we start with writing consultants, say, who should this character be? What is the most helpful version of this character that you think your community is asking for? From there, I will go and write a number of scripts. We are a food science show. I think as kids content creators, we have a responsibility to make inclusive content. And so in and around that food content, I'm including plot points that these consultants suggested would be helpful for listeners in this community to hear. So an example of that, we worked with Jodi and some consultants who are on the autism spectrum with the character. One of the things we included is that Greg, our cheese grater character on the spectrum, just isn't super comfortable making eye contact all the time. And if that's the case, it's not a big deal. It doesn't mean he's not listening. He just doesn't always love making eye contact. It was simple, it was quick, but it was helpful for kids, who aren't on the spectrum to know and have that context for their friends or classmates who might be on the spectrum. And it's something that I wouldn't have never known to include if I didn't start with and work with consultants. After you write something, send it to a sensitivity reader, hire a voice actor who is a part of the community that you're representing. And when you hire a voice actor who's a part of the community you're representing, they are not a sensitivity reader. And so if you are not paying them to read the content and say that it's okay, don't ask them to do that. And don't assume that that's something that they offer, because probably they don't, so you want a sensitivity reader or a writing consultant in addition to an actor who is a part of the community being represented. And following that sort of model, we have not hit any snags, and we've gotten just a lot of really positive feedback from a lot of different communities that makes the work feel super worthwhile.
Yeah, it's just so important to be, that's, I think, what we've found in the autistic community is, being hired, that is important part of it too, not just telling the story, but being hired is really important. I think we only have a few minutes left, and I want to at least touch on this last thing about, and both you, Chad and Melly, already mentioned some things about monetizing a kids and family podcast, and how do the U.S. has the FCC Children's Online Privacy Protection Rule, or COPPA. How do those rules impact kids podcasts in general and monetization? I know that at this stage of our podcast, we've been focusing on some grant opportunities and some individual supporters. And what's been exciting about the work that we've been doing is that it's led to more work for my creative team, which has been really exciting. One got a full-time job writing for an adult mental health podcast as a lead writer. So that's been really, really great. Both of you, Melly, Chad, what are some of the ways that your shows are being monetized other than the ones that you've mentioned? Melly, maybe first.
Besides like the programming that I talked about before, ads, like a couple ads here and there from like books and things to promote diverse books about Black authors, things like that. And also doing like writing panels for high schoolers and middle schoolers, teaching them how to write stories, any kind of consulting. So taking the skills that I use to make the podcast and then teaching others to do that. And I think sometimes we forget about that. We think that the show itself needs to be monetized, but like, you're creating the show. So like, go get paid to help somebody else, you know? So everyone think about that.
Yeah, that's good. Chad?
Yeah, I agree completely. I would just add Patreon and other crowdfunding sources, like the NPR model. You know, if our listeners really appreciate the content, we ask them to donate what they can. And it does help. I will say it's a struggle. You know, with Girl Tales, we've been going for years, and it's hard to make a living doing this. It's hard to pay the people who are creating content with you. And so if you're having trouble, I don't think you're alone in that. It is definitely a challenge. One thing that we did is, you know, piggybacking off of Melly's, thinking outside the box. We do every Christmas, thank you for the Webby shout out, Melly. Every Christmas we do personalized fairy tales. And so we have like a fairy tale that parents can buy, and then we just swap the kid's name out of that episode. So it becomes like a personalized episode of the show for that kid in particular. It's messy to make. It's a ton of work. It's not the most profitable, but we do make some money off of that. And so like trying to find other things to sell to your listeners, I think is valid. Talking just a tiny bit about COPA compliance laws. When you're advertising on a kid's podcast, you have to direct it to grownups. If you are asking them to go to a website, if you're doing any type of call to action, you can't direct that at children. And so it's always, hey, grownups, this is a message for you. Hey, grownups, if you want to learn more about this, go here. And so, yeah, I think that's an important thing to learn more about before you start trying to
And
monetize.
I think I really think that if people want to know how to do that really well, to go listen to some mystery recipe episodes, because I just think it's brilliant the way that you have a show sponsor and sprinkled throughout, you have, hey, grown up messages. And I think
Cool.
it's done really well. Yeah.
Thank you.
So let's wrap this up. Laura, I'm going to give you the last word. What do you think about the future of kids podcasts?
I think it's bright. I'm really excited about it. I mean, just coming on into, you know, the space 2 years ago, I was already excited as I kind of like dove down the rabbit hole and just meeting. I mean, I make it a point to meet with creators and really understand their direction and really build those relationships, because I think that's really important for Common Sense, because we know that discoverability is really difficult. We are trying to like really help and solve that in some way. If we can try to get, you know, shows into our like Apple curations, like we're there to build up the kids content community. So, you know, I think it looks bright. I think there's a lot of content that's already out there, but I think there's so much white space to fill. And I'm excited to see what gets made, because I think the beauty of the podcast space is that there's never too much of anything, right? Because different kids need different things and want to hear different voices. And there is so much need there. And again, not just from parents for like a screen-free option for their kids, but, you know, from educators, right? And podcasts are just becoming so huge in parents' lives that is like a staple media now, that it's very clear that that's going to move on to the next generation. So we're raising the next generation of podcast listeners and creators as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. All right, Amanda, back to you.
Well, I just wanted to thank all of you so much for sharing your insights. I think there's so many opportunities, and it's just wonderful to hear this being used as not only a growth opportunity for many enterprise and other driven folks on this call, but also for educators and to cultivate, as Laura so succinctly put, future podcast creators and listeners, which we know is still a very small part of the media consuming public. Not that we're here to market, we're here to create the joyful experiences for the young people and their families. I just wanted to again, just brief for the folks who are listening from home. A lot of great questions were submitted on effective marketing tactics. So let me just brief them. Chad contributed a favorite marketing tactic is cross promotion. That was named several times. At TPA, we do have a cross promotion channel, find a guest, be a guest, that can also be leveraged for that. So please do use that, TPA members. It's such a great way to collaborate. Alosi from Jade Media submitted some really good questions on connecting with educators. And I just wanted to bounce this to the audience, since I don't see an open Q&A right now on this. Do's or don'ts on not sounding like a marketer when you're communicating to educators who are a very specific, I'd say, audience, and certainly I'd say customer, if you will. Anybody want to take that one?
I think it starts with connecting with your friends who are educators. Like, everyone has a teacher friend. Everyone has somebody that's in education. So, you know, I had my educated friends reach out and say, hey, I want to use your show in, you know, in my second grade class. So talking to your friends that are already in your community about what ways, or do you know anyone who might need this? So it doesn't sound like I'm pitching to you, but, you know, finding who might need it in your parent circle is a great.
We have direct relationships with the education community. So if anyone ever wants to have that discussion about our educators are constantly asking us for more and more ed webs and things like that around podcasting. So we're always looking to work with podcast creators and, you know, feature them in those webinars. So please feel free to reach out about that, because we have that direct connection and trust in the education space.
Yeah, and I think also I wanted to name that, you know, that question was touched on by Susan, who submitted that, and Chad shared that, you know, when it comes to the content, which I think we're all reading the news and noticing that the tenor of the many variables that educators and administrators are factoring in when it comes to the content put in front of young people, especially when it comes to identity or social emotional learning or anything that some people have decided is going to be the topic of the internet today. It is trust-based, as Laura said, and then certainly positive outreach has outnumbered the negative when it comes to inclusion. So it probably sounds like it's also about how you're packaging it. You want to support the educational initiatives, and certainly what you're really trying to do is say, hey, you know, this would really be a fun experience for you, teacher, who is probably trying to find ways to capture your young people's attention. I'm just kind of repackaging what was shared throughout this amazing panel. Let me just see if there's any other questions. We did touch on the COPA laws. I'm going to drop that into the chat here, but COPA is COPPA, and that is a mandate from the Federal Trade Commission in the United States. For our international listeners, I know we had somebody dialing in from India. We are certainly aware that we have other factors when it comes to IP, as well as the marketing and messaging and the local and also kind of other governance when it comes to the topics. So those are other factors. And I think, as Chad had named earlier, partnering with somebody from the community and consulting with them and checking with them, as well as consulting with these wonderful experts, is probably the way to go. I don't want to put words in anybody else's mouth. I'm seeing some really great lively chat here. Dania, our participant, said consider partnering with arts orgs, as they have an arts education programming connection with schools. That's a really good in partnering with people who already have that trusted relationship. It is, again, coming back to that magical word trust, which we know is certainly a marketing word here, but especially for young people, that is absolutely something taken very seriously by these panelists.
I also think local
ahead,
libraries, you know, starting there, because they're always looking to do, we've done some events and live storytelling type events and things with the local libraries. It's been really good. Yeah. And sometimes they, Jonathan, our host, has gotten paid for doing those live storytelling events because they have a budget. So that's been really good.
Yeah, my first live thing was with a local library and it was just a story time on Zoom like this. And we did a trivia afterwards, you know, 30, 45 minutes, quick and easy.
Gamification. I know that's the magic word for educators and for podcasters as well. In fact, Melly, since we have you on the line, final question, I'm seeing it in the chat. And again, thanks everybody for submitting these great questions. Melly, you touched on some things that you were doing, conversations you're having that are used in schools, and you have somebody asking, is your work being used by individual teachers, or is it being integrated into school-wide programming and curricula?
Oh, it's mainly like specific teachers. Like an English teacher will say, hey, we're doing a unit on writing. Can you come in and teach, my sixth graders how to craft a story? Or I have a theater teacher. Hey, can you come? We're trying to do a podcast unit in theater. Can you come and help us with our podcast? So start small with specific teachers who have specific areas in their units or in their curriculum to pinpoint, and then word of mouth. They're like, oh my God, this great person.
Yeah.
Go to the school. Like if you try to hit the whole school at once, that may be overwhelming. They don't have the budget, but specific teachers who could throw you $200 there to teach sixth graders how to write a story,
I also think, I don't mean to interrupt you, Melly, I'm sorry.
Oh no, you're fine.
I don't know how Story Pirates does it, but they have a great school program. And so, trying to see exactly what they're doing, or check out their website to see if they have any information about it. But they're always in schools doing writing workshops.
Yeah. And also going to the schools that want you. Stop going to the schools that don't want your content. Like that's my last real comment of the day. Don't go to the schools that don't want your content, that don't want what you're doing. Go to the people that want it, that desire it, and that will value it, because you'll get the best bang for your buck out of that.
I love that. That's just a general self-care message as well. Because as podcasters and marketers, I'm sure everybody has to, gracefully receive the no, not right now at this time, go in a different direction language here. And the last thing I will say, I used to work in education. I had a much more challenging thing to pitch, which was adjacent to sex education. And I always had to partner very specifically with people who are most likely to champion and adopt the content. And I did find faster responses to private or charter programs, which have just fewer levels of bureaucracy. So that's my contribution here as a non-kid podcaster, although I am excited to integrate all these knowledge to help include family listeners, because some of my content is appropriate for young listeners and would be, I think, hopefully embraced. Anywho, want to thank everybody here. I am going to quickly screen share my thank you message to everybody who joined us. If you have attended and enjoyed it, we'd love to hear your feedback, as well as what you would like to see and hear from that is of relevance and value to you, fellow podcast professionals. Go to tinyurl.com/TPA exit web. Again, all you wonderful live attendees will be emailed in about a day or so, if not sooner, with a special discount code to join us, because you will be able to certainly access this and other programming. So with that, I'm going to thank again all of our
I'm going to do a pitch to join TPA,
right.
because
Yes,
we need more kids podcasters as a part of TPA. So come join.
Join us. Yes. And name Jodi Murphy as your referral person, or Melly, or Chad, or Laura. We are all here. Let me just go ahead and stop recording here.